Welcome everyone to this week's episode of Finding Your Freedom podcast, and today I want to talk about something that was a real dilemma for me, so I thought I'd share this with you. And this is whether you should tell your employer about your eating disorder. And I think that this might be something a lot of you who are thinking about choosing to start recovery might need to wrestle with or might be concerned about. And it's quite a difficult and quite a deeply personal decision whether to share with anybody that you have an eating disorder. And for a lot of people, certainly with me, work I think was a space where I could almost hide behind my professional role to avoid people knowing that I had an eating disorder. So you may be in a job where you perform really well, you meet everyone's expectations, and maybe no one around you has any idea of what is really going on underneath. And that is true for me. I worked all the way through my eating disorder for the last 30 years until it got really quite serious, and I eventually had no choice but to take time off for recovery. And when I had to make that decision, I had to decide, do I tell my employer the real reason why I need to take time off or not? So I want to share a bit about that experience with you and talk about both sides, whether it's a good idea or not. And of course that is going to be personal for you, but hopefully talking about this today might help you make a decision. So many people with eating disorders, unless they're very physically unwell, can function perfectly well, and for some at an incredibly high level. Many people go to work, study, care for families, and no one would ever guess what is going on inside. And for me, that was true. For me, I had a mask. It was a mask that I wore every day, and I became very skilled at keeping everything looking like it was fine on the outside. And that actually was part of the decision why wanting to tell my employer was really hard. Because sometimes telling someone at work, especially if that's maybe a person in authority, it means you're going to have to take the mask off and show what's really going on and maybe show some vulnerability. And for me, it brought up a huge amount of fear and shame and guilt and feelings of low self-worth. Because maybe there's a worry that people start to see you differently, and maybe you'll be judged as less capable or less professional in some way. And that's really quite sad, because if you had any other kind of illness, you wouldn't really think twice about being open and honest with your employer or even your colleagues. But when it's an eating disorder, of course, there is still that stigma. And you might be worried that if you tell your employer, well, maybe they'll think you're not strong enough or capable enough to do your job. And I think that's probably a real fear for a lot of people. But I just want to say here that having an eating disorder doesn't define your worth or your talent or your professionalism. Many people function perfectly well at work. I was perfectly capable of doing my job. I didn't get any complaints. The level of my work didn't suffer. So having an eating disorder doesn't mean you are less capable. It just means that you might have to have some adjustments for a period or take some time off to recover, and you go back to your job being perfectly capable. So why then is it so scary to tell an employer? Well, part of that fear, of course, is going to come from how your eating disorder operates, because it's going to thrive on the secrecy and the shame and wanting it to be just between you and it, your little secret. You know, it'll tell you it'll keep you safe if you don't tell anyone about me. So yeah, of course, the eating disorder wants you to keep the whole thing hidden. And your eating disorder is going to tell you things like, if you tell anyone, they'll reject you, or they'll think you are less than, or they will ridicule you, or they will judge you. But actually what your eating disorder really fears, by you telling anyone else, whether that's an employer or family or friends, it just fears honesty and openness and connection. Because those are the very things that are going to break the power it has over you and lead you into recovery. So when you're considering whether to tell an employer, it might not just be a practical question. It might be quite a considerable part of your healing journey. If you feel it's the right thing to do to tell them, then that in itself actually is a really brave step. And you're going to need to be brave in recovery. So taking that brave step maybe makes you feel a bit more confident about the courage you might have in recovery, because every brave step just gives you a little bit more sense of power and confidence that's probably been stripped away from you in your eating disorder. So there's usually two circumstances where you might need to tell an employer. And the first one might be that you're planning to take time off work to focus on your recovery. Or it might be that you're continuing to work, but you're going to need extra support or some adjustments to help you manage your recovery. So let's start with the option of taking time off. When I reached the point of taking time off work, both my GP and my recovery coach had told me that taking time off was going to be the best chance for me of a real lasting recovery. And that wasn't an easy thing for me to hear, because I'd worked for my employer for about 14 years at that time, and I'd never had a single day off sick. And in truth, my whole identity was probably built around being capable and reliable and organised. And I think that's the case for many people with eating disorders. We kind of tie our sense of worth to our achievements, and we work hard and we push through exhaustion, and we take pride in never needing help or looking like we're weak. So when someone says you need to take a break, for me it initially felt like I was a little bit of a failure. But looking back now, it was the opposite. I think it was one of the bravest choices I ever made, and probably one of the best choices that I made for my recovery. And that doesn't mean it's the right choice for you. Not everyone is going to have the same circumstances as me. But like I said, every brave choice you make makes the next choice easier. And for me, taking time away from my job was a turning point, and it gave me some space to look at my life. I think from the outside in, I had to take myself out of the day-to-day to really have a look at what was really going on, not just with my eating disorder, but in my life in general. And it gave me a chance to see, I think, how deeply my eating disorder had crept into every corner of my world, including how I worked and how I handled stress and how I viewed success and how I'd become a people pleaser and a perfectionist. All of those things, I had a chance to look from the outside in to see how my eating disorder really was mixed up in all different areas of my life, and particularly with my work. And I'll say this now, recovery, of course it's going to be about eating more food and physically recovering, but it's not just about that. If you can take time out of your life, it can actually be just a time for emotional healing and reflection, and learning to process feelings and rewiring beliefs that you've had about yourself. And that can take time, and it's actually quite hard to do when you're trying to maintain a job and when you don't have that space to see how maybe some of the things you've been doing in your life really kind of need an adjustment to keep you well in the future. When we're in our daily lives, I think we rarely see sometimes how things affect us. I think sometimes if you get the opportunity to take a step outside, then you can really start to see where you've maybe formed unhealthy habits or unhealthy beliefs about yourself. So my advice, if taking time off is a possibility for you, I would say seriously consider it. It doesn't have to be forever, but having a bit of breathing space can really, I think, transform your recovery. It can really give you time to feel all those emotions and to rest and to be able to focus purely on recovery without any of the stresses that naturally going to work is probably going to bring you. And also because physically the early stages of recovery can be quite tough when your body is changing and you're going to experience some difficult symptoms initially, like bloating and water retention, and feeling quite exhausted and feeling different kinds of discomfort while your body is adapting to you eating food more regularly. So if you can take time off and go through those changes in a safe place, a private space, while not sitting in your office and feeling maybe physically uncomfortable or maybe feeling really tired, then those are reasons why taking time off might be a good idea. But if you are continuing to work because you want to or because you have to, because not everyone gets the option to take time off, financially that might not be an issue, or it might be an issue for you. So maybe you can't take time off, and that's completely valid. And maybe you want to work because you enjoy work. But I think if you're choosing recovery alongside work, then it might be that communication with your employer is still important. Because if you're going to do recovery properly, my belief is that you maybe are going to need to make changes to your everyday routine, especially around food and rest. You probably can't go on as you were, working with no rest and no food, if that's what you've been doing. It certainly was what I was doing. And in recovery, you're going to need to rest and eat more than just a person who isn't going through recovery. You're going to need to eat regular meals and probably larger portions than you're used to. And you're probably going to need to take breaks outside of your usual lunch hour because you need to eat more regularly than just the 3 meals that you've been having before. And you might need to have lots of snacks, and you might need to honour periods of real hunger in your recovery. So you might need to be eating more food and more regularly, even if you are continuing to work. So it might be things like you need an extra break in the morning and an extra break in the afternoon to eat more regularly and to honour those hunger signals that come along, and that don't just come along at meal times, they can come at any time. And maybe that means telling your employer when you need to take more time away from your desk or take time away from whatever it is you're doing, and make them understand why that is. It's also important, I think, just to say, to make sure you are able to eat when you're hungry and in the amount required when you are at work. If you are going to continue to work, then meal planning will become important. You need to make sure you bring enough food to work with you so you can eat any time you are hungry. So think about, aside from bringing in your lunch, that you're bringing plenty of calorie-dense snacks that will nourish and satisfy you and help you to concentrate without being distracted by hunger, and to help with rebuilding your body and your brain, and that's all, of course, going to require a lot of energy. Another thing you have to remember is that if you are not taking breaks and you're not eating those amounts of food that you need at work, what you're actually doing is showing your brain that you're restricting. So being at home, you might be honouring all of that hunger and eating regularly and doing all those things that are showing your brain the restriction is over. But if you're not planning that you can do that at work, and if you're not making that happen at work, you might not be restricting on purpose, but you might accidentally end up restricting food because you've not planned accordingly, and you are not eating when you are hungry, and you might work through lunch because everything is stressful. And that's just going to show your brain a message of restriction. It's going to start to doubt the recovery process. It's vital to show your brain that consistency in food is safe and always available. And another reason maybe you might tell your employer is you might feel self-conscious eating more at work than you're used to, or maybe eating a lot more than your colleagues do. So it might be worth talking to your employer about maybe having a private space where you can go and have some food if you're feeling particularly self-conscious. Now, I think it's important to be careful here, because your eating disorder, of course, quite often wants you to eat in secret, and everything is secret, and it's not necessarily healthy to continue to eat in secret, maybe like you did in your eating disorder. And I think you should avoid doing that at home, with your friends, with your family. But if feeling self-conscious in front of others who maybe you don't know about your recovery journey, or you don't know them very well because they're colleagues, if that is the difference between you eating and not, then telling your employer you need some privacy may help you. And another reason you might want to think about telling your employer is appointments. So you might have medical appointments with your GP to check on how you're doing physically, therapy appointments, coaching appointments, and you might need to fit those into your schedule. You might not be able to do all those things at weekends or in the evenings, so you might want to discuss how your workload could be adjusted temporarily to facilitate some extra time out of work. Or it might just be that you need to take on a little bit of less stressful work when you're going through the period of recovery, because things are going to feel quite difficult emotionally and physically anyway. And one thing, if you do decide to tell your employer, and this was really important for me, if you do tell them, please do not apologise for having this illness. I think initially I felt like I should apologise to people for it, because I felt it was something maybe I brought on myself, something people wouldn't understand, maybe people would think it was a choice. Please do not apologise for having this illness, no more than you would apologise for having any other illness. It is not your fault. You didn't choose it, and you deserve the same understanding and any other accommodations and adaptations from your employer that anyone else with any other illness would receive. Now, of course, your employer might not really understand eating disorders, and they might not have ever encountered somebody who had one before. And if that's the case, and if they seem shocked or uncertain, or they don't know what to say, or they don't know how to help you, it might help to offer to connect them with your GP, or if you have a coach, someone who can explain to them why during this period of recovery you might need some adaptations, and just to help them understand what it is and understand what recovery is and what it's for. And ultimately it's going to mean that you're going to be in recovery quicker, you're going to be back at work in a full capacity, and you're going to be just as good as ever at your job. And I do think most employers probably genuinely do want to support their staff, but when it comes to something like an eating disorder, they might just not understand, and so it might be helpful, if you can't explain it yourself, to have someone else to help you with that. And I just want to mention here a little bit about your legal rights if you are going to take time off with an eating disorder. You don't actually have to tell your employer why you're off sick. So if you don't want them to know and you think that might be detrimental to you in the future with your employer, then you can be off sick if your GP believes it's the best thing for you, and you don't have to give the reason. In the UK, you're not legally required to tell your employer the specific reason why you're off. And for the first 7 days, you can self-certify and just be off sick by telling your employer that you're unwell. But after that, you will need something from your GP to tell them how long you're going to be off work for. Now, I did tell my employer the reason why I was taking time off, but because I didn't want other people within the firm who might have access to my HR records to know the reason, I got my GP to write ongoing medical treatment on my sick note as being the reason that I was off. And he actually didn't ever mention in writing that I had an eating disorder. And one other thing is that your medical information is private, so your GP can't tell your employer or share any details about your illness without your consent. And if you choose to tell your employer that you do have an eating disorder, then that information is protected under UK data protection law, so your employer must also keep it confidential and only share it with people who genuinely need to know in your workplace, which is probably just your HR department. And under the Equality Act, an eating disorder can be considered a disability if it has substantial and long-term effects on your daily life. Now, of course, I hope that isn't the case for you. I hope that by reaching out for help with recovery, you can deal with your eating disorder so it doesn't have long-term impact, but for some people it might. So if you have an eating disorder that does have long-term effects, then in that case, you may be protected against discrimination, and your employer has a duty to make reasonable adjustments to support you, like flexible breaks, time off for appointments, or reduced workloads. So please know you do have rights and you do have choices. So let's move on to maybe talking to colleagues about your eating disorder. When I took time off, I didn't tell my colleagues the reason. Not because I didn't trust them or like them, or I just was still getting comfortable sharing it with the people that were really close to me, so my family and friends. And it was just a little bit too overwhelming at that stage to share it with colleagues. But for some of you, some of your best friends might work with you. You might have really close friendships in your workplace. And if you do have them, and you have people you trust, then maybe tell them, because it really can be quite freeing to tell people. I think I've maybe mentioned this in other episodes. When you start to open up about your eating disorder and let go of those feelings of shame and guilt and secrecy, it's quite a large step in your recovery, and it will give you the confidence to make you feel a little bit more powerful. So if you have those relationships at work, then tell the people that you want to tell, and of course I'm sure you'll be supported by them if they are the friends that you think they are. And I honestly believe people are probably only going to respond with empathy and respect and admiration, and will be cheering you on all the way, and that might make it easier for you at work. And a reason that sharing might be that we're just challenging the stigma of eating disorders. All of us who've had one, the more we talk about it, the more we challenge the secrecy, and that we show others that an eating disorder isn't anything to be ashamed of and that recovery is possible, then those conversations count, because maybe your work colleagues talk to other people they know about you and your eating disorder and recovery, and maybe the message just gets out there that it's not shameful, it's not secretive, and that a good life is possible in recovery, and that you know someone who has recovered, and that might just help someone else make a decision. So, one last thing to think about. What if your job itself is, I'm not going to say causing your eating disorder. I don't think anyone's eating disorder has probably ever been caused by a job. I think there's probably other reasons why someone would have an eating disorder, but I think someone's job might impact the severity of their eating disorder. Because eating disorders thrive on stress. They thrive when you are feeling everything is too much and everything is a bit overwhelming, and it becomes your safe place. So if your job is feeding your eating disorder in that sense, maybe the culture, the hours, the stress, the perfectionism that it demands, then maybe you need to ask yourself some difficult questions. If you stay in that role, is it going to allow you to recover fully, or is it going to reinforce the patterns that you're trying to break? And that's why I took time off. I needed to know if I could stay in my job as a recovered person, but I had to take time out to work that out. I definitely had to take time out to do the recovery process, because working in a highly pressurised, stressful environment of being a lawyer, I knew I wouldn't be able to fully recover or break those patterns that were feeding my eating disorder. And my message is recovery has to come first, because you will always find another job, but you only get one life, and you deserve to live it free from an eating disorder, and not just functioning, but actually living a great life. So whether you choose to tell your employer or not, you're not weak for needing support. You are human and you are healing, and you don't have to do this on your own. So thank you everyone for listening today. If this episode resonated with you, then please do reach out for support, and remember, your recovery is worth more than any job title.